Mallory's laugh cut through the backyard chatter. He's just our ATM. I'm Lennox Greaves, 55. A retired accountant clutching the house keys, I drained my savings for their metal cold in my palm as the citronella candles flickered. Ever been blindsided by family words that sting worse than any bill? I didn't expect my daughter-in-law's voice to cut through the hum of conversation like a serrated blade. He's just our ATM, honestly. The sentence hung in the humid Ohio air for a half-second, almost muffled by the sizzle of the grill and the clinking of ice in plastic cups. But I heard it as clearly as if she had whispered it into my ear. The laughter around the patio hiccuped, not quite dying, but breaking long enough for me to know I hadn't misheard. Someone coughed. The sound of a citronella candle being adjusted filled the silence for a breath. Then the chatter picked up again like nothing had happened. I kept my face still, as though I'd only heard a bird squawk in the maple tree overhead, but something inside me folded over like wet cardboard. I shifted my weight and the keys in my pocket jingled softly, a metallic reminder of the house I'd helped them buy, the mortgage payments I'd quietly shouldered, and the stability I'd given them when they were both too young and too busy to think about anything beyond vacations and dinner reservations. That sound felt heavier than the entire yard full of people. I rubbed the ridge of the largest key with my thumb through the fabric of my slacks and stared out at the yard as if the fireflies above the hedges had suddenly fascinated me. Mallory stood near the grill, wine glass in hand, her blonde hair catching the orange light from the tiki torches Jasper had proudly stuck into the mulch beds earlier that afternoon. She didn't even glance my way. To her, the words she'd just spoken were harmless chatter, the kind of thing people shrug off with a laugh. But I saw the way one of her friends raised her brows, then glanced at me and quickly looked away. Jasper didn't speak. He fiddled with the tongs flipping burgers that were already overdone his face, as neutral as the cloudy July sky. I couldn't tell if he'd even heard her or if he was just too practiced in not reacting. I stayed rooted near the picnic table, feigning interest in the conversation about the Akron Rubber Ducks minor league game, nodding when someone mentioned ticket prices going up again. The air was thick with barbecue smoke and citronella, the kind of mingled smell that reminds you of summer's long-gone cookouts. When my wife Ellen was still alive, and Jasper was just a boy darting around barefoot with a ketchup-stained t-shirt. That memory tugged at me hot and sharp like the ember from the grill that popped and landed near my shoe. I decided not to say anything. There was no dignity in snapping at a 33-year-old who wouldn't understand anyway, and no satisfaction in embarrassing Jasper in front of their neighbors. I placed my plastic cup down on the table, the condensation leaving a damp ring on the wood, and offered a polite nod to the circle of conversation I wasn't really part of. "Excuse me a moment," I said, voice steady, and I turned toward the side gate. The yard's lights dimmed as I walked past the hedge, the cheerful noise receding behind me. By the fence, under the flicker of a single bug zapper light, I stopped for a breath. My fingers found the keys again, curling around them until their jagged edges pressed into my palm. They felt heavier with each breath I took. The laughter and clinking of glasses in the distance felt like it came from a life I no longer had any rightful claim to, even though my savings literally anchored the roof over Mallory and Jasper's heads. As I lingered by the fence, Mallory's friend, a tall woman I didn't recognize, caught my eye. She hesitated by the back door, offering a strained smile and a soft, awkward "goodnight, mister" Greaves, as if she'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to. I nodded, managing the thinnest smile I could muster, and turned away before my face betrayed what I felt. Her awkwardness confirmed what I already knew: Mallory hadn't been joking. Those words weren't some playful, wine-fueled jab. They were her truth said, with the kind of carelessness that only comes when someone believes you don't really matter beyond what you provide. I slipped out the side gate, the hinges squealing like they hadn't been oiled in years, and stepped into the cooler darkness of the driveway. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, a steady summer drone that filled the space Mallory's voice had left ringing in my ears. I felt the keys swing against my leg with each step, the faint chink-chink marking the pace of my thoughts. My jaw tightened with every sound. I didn't slam the gate behind me. I didn't mutter curses under my breath. I just walked the heavy scent of smoke still clinging to my shirt, planning quietly. As I reached my car parked a block away, I looked back once at the glow of their porch light spilling over the lawn chairs, the faint shadows of people moving behind sheer curtains. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like family there, just a visitor who had overstayed. I unlocked my car, the keys chiming once more in my palm, before I slid behind the wheel. The night was silent except for that sound, and it was all I needed to remind me things were about to change. Back in my apartment, the stillness carried a different weight than it usually did, as if every mundane sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the slow, deliberate tick of the wall clock above my sink, was exaggerating just how alone I really was. I flicked on the single overhead light in the kitchen, its bulb buzzing faintly, throwing shadows across the linoleum floor that had been peeling near the cabinets for the past 2 years. The air smelled faintly of dust, and the reheated burger I'd picked up from a drive-thru on my way home. Now cold on the counter, congealed cheese stuck like glue to the bun. I dropped my keys onto the table, their sharp clatter bouncing off the narrow walls. The walls themselves were lined sparsely. No cheerful decorations like Mallory favored, no art or new appliances. Just the things I kept out of habit. 2 framed photos, one of Ellen smiling on our last trip before her illness, the other of a much younger Jasper, no older than 8, holding a baseball bat too big for his hands, grinning like the world was nothing but promise. I sat down at the kitchen table, unwrapped the burger, and took a bite that was both bland and rubbery, washing it down with a flat cola from a can I'd opened hours earlier. The carbonation had long since fled, leaving it syrupy and limp. It wasn't the first evening I'd spent like this, and I doubted it would be the last. Ever since 2019, when I'd taken early retirement from a 28-year career as an internal auditor at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, the apartment had become less of a sanctuary and more of a stopgap. Back then, I'd told myself stepping away from work was the right thing. Ellen had been gone for 3 years by that point, and Jasper and Mallory were starting to talk seriously about putting down roots. They couldn't get approved for a mortgage big enough to buy the house they wanted, not with Jasper's modest income and Mallory's student loans still looming, so I had offered to help. Between 2019 and 2021, nearly every dividend check and most of the savings I'd meant for my own twilight years had gone to that down payment and the closing costs to repairs and to covering a few lean months when Jasper's hours were cut during the pandemic slowdown. I never once asked them to sign anything beyond the shared purchase contract. Never once reminded them that without my backing, the roof over their heads wouldn't exist. To me, it was family. It was what Ellen would have done, even if it meant eating cold burgers and sipping flat soda, while my former co-workers swapped retirement stories from Florida condos. The purchase contract folded neatly and tucked inside the bottom drawer of my desk hadn't seen daylight in months. I hadn't needed it, or at least I'd told myself that. Until tonight. My eyes drifted toward that desk, the small pool of light from the desk lamp catching on its wood veneer. I chewed my last bite mechanically, wiped my hands on a napkin, and walked over. The chair creaked as I sat down, the silence of the apartment pressing in tighter as I pulled open the drawer. The paper was cool and smooth under my fingertips, its edges perfectly squared, the ink still crisp on the signatures. It felt heavier than paper had any right to, as though it contained more than legal terms. And obligations, it carried the weight of every sacrifice I'd made. A soft ping from my phone broke the moment. I reached over and saw Silas's name glowing on the screen. Not a call he rarely called at this hour, but an email short as always. Len, keep every document and receipt. Quiet strength wins battles. Don't get baited into arguments. They'll show their hand soon enough. His voice, even through text, had that calm, pragmatic edge that I'd come to trust over decades. We'd met back in my auditing days, and while most of my colleagues had drifted out of touch after I retired, Silas had a way of checking in right when I needed grounding. I set the phone down and almost without thinking reached for the house keys I'd left on the kitchen table. I brought them into the cone of light spilling from the lamp. The brass teeth caught the glow, throwing little reflections across the wood. I rolled them in my palm, feeling each groove, each notch. Not as something mundane, but as a reminder that I still had more than sentimentality tied to that house. It wasn't just about what I'd given, it was about what I still legally held. The thought didn't thrill me, didn't make me smug, but it did settle something restless inside me. I laid the keys down beside the contract, the two of them looking almost like artifacts from a life I had willingly diminished to keep Jasper and Mallory's afloat. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder in the stillness, the tick of the clock sharper, as if both were keeping count of every second I'd spent living quietly on the sidelines. I opened the cupboard, pulled down a lowball glass, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon from the bottle I saved for nights like this. Nights when I needed the warmth more than the taste. The liquid swirled amber in the lamplight, almost the same hue as the brass keys. I sat there until midnight, sipping slowly, staring at the papers and metal laid out before me, as though they were a chessboard, and I was just beginning to remember how to play. Every now and then I'd glance at Ellen's photo on the wall, wondering if she'd tell me to fight or to forgive. Either way, I knew something had shifted tonight. I wasn't just a silent benefactor anymore. Those keys in that contract weren't relics, they were leverage. And for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of a plan taking shape, one measured and deliberate the way I'd lived my entire professional life. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, and the soft glint of brass and ink kept me company, as the bourbon warmed my chest, steadying me for whatever came next. The smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs hit me before I even pushed the door all the way open, a scent that clung to the chrome-trimmed walls and the vinyl seats like it had been simmering there since the Carter administration. The place was nearly empty, save for a pair of truckers in the far corner, talking quietly, over plates stacked with pancakes, and a jukebox in the corner, humming out a warbly rendition of some forgotten 80s country tune. I slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl creaking under me, and wrapped my hands around the chipped ceramic mug, already waiting for me. The coffee inside was black and bitter, but it kept my fingers warm as I watched the door. Silas appeared a minute later, just as the waitress shuffled past, with a fresh plate of hash browns for someone at the counter. He moved like he always did, deliberate, steady, as though rushing was a vice he'd long ago sworn off. His salt and pepper hair was tucked neatly under a faded ball cap from some trade show we'd both attended years ago, and his pale gray jacket hung loose on his shoulders, the faint scent of aftershave trailing behind him. He slid into the booth across from me with a soft grunt and gave me a look that was equal parts knowing and calm, like he'd already guessed why I'd called him. "Patience, Len," he said, even before I could open my mouth. His voice had that low rumble I remembered from all those years we'd worked side by side, a tone that made people lean in without realizing it. He picked up the sugar dispenser, tapped it once against the rim of my mug, and continued, "Don't shout. Don't storm in waving papers like some madman. Build your case quietly. That's how you win the real fights." I nodded, lifting the mug to my lips. The coffee was as bitter as burnt toast, but it did its job, jolting me awake in ways more than one. I reached into my jacket pocket and slid my phone across the table screen, lit just enough for him to see the glowing rectangle. On it, frozen and slightly blurry, but legible, was a snapshot of Mallory's email to her attorney, captured quietly on Jasper's laptop screen when I'd stopped by the house the night before. She hadn't noticed me coming down the hall as she chatted in the kitchen. Jasper had been out back watering the garden, oblivious. I hadn't intended to snoop, but when I saw her laptop open the subject line, bold as brass title transfer options, urgent my instincts as a man who'd spent nearly 3 decades poring over financial discrepancies took over. Silas leaned forward, squinting at the phone without touching it. The diner light reflected faintly on his glasses, obscuring his eyes for a beat. Then he leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, a sign I'd come to know as his version of a raised eyebrow. So he murmured, his fingers drumming once on the Formica tabletop. "They're not just thinking about it, they're planning it, without telling you." "They think I'm too old to notice," I said, keeping my voice low, almost drowned out by the hiss of the griddle in the kitchen, "or too soft to care." I set the phone down and pushed it back toward myself. I haven't confronted them. Yet. I don't plan to. Not until the timing's right. Silas tilted his head, his mouth twitching at the corner in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good. Keep it that way. If you push now, they'll spin it as paranoia or bitterness. You push at the right time, though, with the right stage." He trailed off, glancing toward the muted local news playing on the mounted TV above the counter, where a scrolling banner announced the next Akron town meeting scheduled for Thursday. "You said they're trying to get HOA approval for those renovations." "That meeting is your stage, Len. Public orderly with records kept. You don't even have to raise your voice, just show up prepared. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth seep through my chest, settling the jittery edge that had been with me since the backyard barbecue. The keys and the purchase contract weren't with me physically, but their weight was in my mind, tangible and reassuring. Those weren't weapons for shouting matches, they were shields, proof of my standing and the silent power I still held. Silas reached for the paper napkin tucked beside his plate, pulled a pen from his jacket, and scribbled a few bullet points in his precise, almost mechanical handwriting. Bring copies of the contract. Make sure the keys are in your pocket. If they try to push, you don't bite. Let them swing first out loud in front of people who can witness it. You don't need to win a shouting match. You just need to make sure the facts land where they're supposed to. He slid the folded napkin across the table to me. I picked it up, feeling the faint indent of the pen marks through the paper. He tapped my phone gently with one finger, nodding. This, he said quietly, plus that contract. This is your shield. Let them think they've got you cornered. The quieter you are, the harder it'll hit when they realize they don't. The jukebox changed tracks, spilling out a mournful steel guitar that somehow fit the moment. The waitress passed by again, refilling my mug without asking her, eyes flicking curiously between us. I slipped the napkin into my inner jacket pocket, alongside the phone, and slid out of the booth. Silas didn't get up. He just gave me a slow nod, the kind of gesture that said everything without saying anything. Outside, the morning sun felt brighter than it should have, bouncing off the chrome trim of parked cars and forcing me to squint. I paused by my car, running my fingers along the edge of my jacket, where the napkin rested, a faint smirk, tugging at my lips despite myself. I wasn't celebrating, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something steadier than resignation moving through me. Strategy, patience, the kind of quiet resolve that doesn't just react, but waits for the right moment to move. I slid behind the wheel, the hum of the diner's neon sign fading behind me, and drove off toward home. The napkin's weight in my pocket, a reminder that the game wasn't over and I wasn't nearly as powerless as they believed. Mallory's voice sliced through the clinking of silverware like a knife, its sharpness magnified by the cavernous quiet of the dining room. You're not family, Lennox, you're just an investor now. She said it without raising her voice, almost casually, as though stating a fact that had been decided long before this dinner. The words hovered above the table for a beat, heavier than the thick summer air leaking in through the sealed windows. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the central air and the faint rattle of an ice cube settling in someone's glass. The overhead LED lighting glared coldly on the polished surface of their dining table, its unnatural whiteness turning everything sterile, even the food on our plates. Jasper sat to my right, his shoulders hunched, his fork idling on the rim of a plate that still held most of his roast chicken untouched. His eyes didn't lift from the table, not when Mallory's words dropped, not when the silence stretched long enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen. Mallory across from me leaned back in her chair, her wine glass poised delicately between two fingers, her eyes steady but hard. She was dressed like she had somewhere important to be afterward, hair swept into a sleek knot, gold hoops catching the cold light, a soft cream blouse that probably cost as much as my month's groceries. I sat still, my hands resting on my thighs beneath the table, my expression flat. Inside, the words burrowed and sharp and raw, but not surprising. The signs had been building, the email I'd spotted, her cool detachment at the barbecue, the way Jasper had been quieter around me, his glances more fleeting. This was just the first time Mallory had said it out loud, slicing the last remaining thread of politeness. She swirled her wine lazily and added, "We've spoken to someone about retitling the house. It just makes sense now, considering everything. You've been generous, of course, but it's time we make things official. Simpler." Her tone was smooth, but I caught the faint tremor under it, a financial anxiety she was trying to bury beneath condescension. I wondered briefly what bill or balance she was scrambling to cover, but the thought didn't matter as much as the fact that she was cutting me out of the very roof I had built for them. I reached into my pocket for my keys, more out of habit than intent, and they slipped from my grasp. The brass and steel clattered against the hardwood floor, the sound ricocheting through the sterile dining room like a crack in a frozen pond. For a long second, nobody moved. The sound echoed, then dissolved into the hum of the air vents. Slowly, I leaned down and picked them up, feeling the chill of the floor against my fingertips. The weight of each key amplified as I slid them back into my pocket. Jasper cleared his throat softly, as if he might finally say something, but his words evaporated before reaching air. His fork scraped softly against porcelain as he nudged his untouched chicken, his lips pressed thin. He looked tired, not just from the conversation, but from the months of straddling the line between loyalty and passivity. I caught his eye for a fleeting second, and what I saw there wasn't defiance or support, just fatigue. I pushed my chair back, the legs sliding over the polished floor, with a faint groan that seemed louder than it was. "You'll hear from me soon," I said quietly, directing it more at Jasper than Mallory, though I kept my tone even, my face unreadable. I reached for the purchase contract neatly folded in my jacket pocket, its presence suddenly warm against my palm, as though reminding me it was still there, still mine. I slipped it deeper into the inner lining as I stood. Mallory leaned back further in her chair, crossing her legs and flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Without us," she said with a small shrug, "you're just a lonely man with some savings." Her voice dripped with the kind of casual cruelty only someone confident in their upper hand can muster. The words didn't just sting, they settled into my chest like a stone heavy, but solidifying something I hadn't been able to name until now. I didn't bother to answer her. There was nothing to be gained in sparring across this too bright, too clean table where every word would just bounce around until it lost meaning. Instead, I slipped my jacket on, nodding once to Jasper, who still couldn't lift his gaze, and walked toward the door. The overhead lights hummed above me, cold and unyielding. Outside, the summer heat wrapped around me like a damp blanket, heavy, but grounding after the sterile chill of the dining room. The sky was painted in streaks of deep purple and orange as the sun sank below the suburban rooftops. I pulled out my phone, my thumb already hovering over Silas's number. He answered on the second ring, his calm voice a stark contrast to the tight coil in my chest. "Call your lawyer, friend," I said, my tone measured but firm. "It's time." I ended the call before he could reply, sliding the phone into my pocket beside the keys and the folded contract. The faint chime of the keys, as I started walking down the driveway, sounded different now, not like a burden, but like a reminder. They were more than pieces of brass. They were my foothold, my proof, my leverage. Mallory thought she'd cut me out of the picture tonight, but what she didn't understand yet was that this wasn't an ending. It was just the quiet before my move. The glow from their dining room spilled faintly through the curtains as I reached the sidewalk. I didn't look back again. Instead, I kept walking, the evening cicadas humming in the distance, the chill of the keys anchoring me with each step. For the first time in months, I wasn't just drifting in their orbit. I was stepping deliberately into my own. The night air smelled faintly of cut grass and distant charcoal, and I breathed it in like fuel, already mapping out the next call I'd make after Silas. The quiet war they had started was about to meet its first response, not in shouting or slammed doors, but in the slow, deliberate turning of a key. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in my best charcoal slacks, and a pressed button-down I hadn't worn since last Christmas, the fabric still holding a faint scent of cedar from the closet sachets. The sun was dipping behind the rows of maples on their quiet street, painting the edges of the houses in gold. The air smelled of freshly mown grass, and the cicadas had already started their chorus, a muted, restless hum in the distance. I paused on the front steps, running my thumb over the smooth face of my wristwatch, steadying myself for what I thought would be an uncomfortable but necessary conversation. The door opened before I could knock. Mallory stood in the frame arms, crossed no smile. Her lips curled in what might have been mistaken for politeness, if not for the hard glint in her eyes. "This is a family discussion, Lennox," she said softly, her voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Let's not make it awkward." Behind her, the faint murmur of voices and the clink of glass floated out from the dining room where Jasper's shape flickered in the hallway light. He didn't come forward, just lingered like a shadow, his hand brushing the doorframe, his head slightly bowed. I stood there for a beat, the cicadas filling the void between us. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint tang of the wine I could smell Mallory's breath. She tilted her head, her posture radiating a false gentleness, as though she were doing me a kindness by asking me to step aside from a house that wouldn't even exist without my signature on a contract and my life savings. For a moment, I imagined Ellen standing here, shaking her head at the quiet gall of it all. I see, I said finally, my voice level almost flat. I gave Jasper a brief look past her shoulder, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. My fingers brushed the keys in my pocket, their cold metal edges grounding me. Enjoy your discussion. I turned before she could say anything else, descending the porch steps, slowly letting the hum of the cicadas and the crunch of gravel under my shoes fill the silence Mallory left hanging behind me. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than usual. Every red light another chance for the evening to replay in my head. By the time I pulled into the cracked lot behind my building, the anger had settled into something cooler, something sharper. My apartment greeted me with its usual stillness, the refrigerator's low hum, the faint smell of paper and old wood. The ticking wall clock that seemed louder when I was alone. I didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, I went straight to the corner of the living room where my old safe rested beneath the desk, its gray metal scuffed from years of moves. I crouched down, turning the dial slowly until the tumblers aligned with a familiar click. The sound was soft but final, like the sealing of a plan. The door creaked open, revealing the purchase contract, its edges slightly frayed from handling, but the paper itself still firm. I pulled it out carefully along with the neatly kept records of every financial contribution I'd made since 2019, copies of checks, bank transfers, and invoices I'd never thrown away. I spread them across the desk beneath the warm cone of the lamp, the paper rustling softly as I arranged them into a quiet arsenal. The phone on the desk buzzed. A text from Silas lit up the screen. "You ready?" I stared at the words for a moment, my reflection faintly visible in the black border of the phone jaw, tight but steady. I typed back, "more than." Then I placed the phone face down, reached for the contract, and slid it into the flatbed scanner beside me. The machine hummed softly as it came to life, the quiet whirring punctuated by the faint chirp of the cicadas through the open window. The glow of the screen reflected the lines of ink, my name bold in the signature block at the bottom. When the digital copy pinged into my inbox, I opened a new message addressed to a property attorney Silas had recommended months ago during one of our hypothetical conversations. In the subject line, I typed, "Activating Clause D." The cursor blinked for a moment before I hit send. There was no satisfaction in the motion, only a strange calm, as if I had finally stepped off a ledge I'd been standing on for too long. I reached for the printer, loaded a fresh sheet of paper, and pressed print. The machine buzzed and fed out the page, my signature appearing at the bottom in smooth black lines. As I lifted it, the ink was still slightly wet, and a faint smear trailed from the last letter of my name, where my thumb brushed too close. But the signature, my signature, still stood bold, unmistakable, unbroken. I set it on the desk to dry the lamplight, catching on the sheen of the ink, casting a thin shadow along the edge of the page. The apartment was silent again, save for the low hum of the fridge and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. I leaned back in my chair, the brass keys in my pocket, digging lightly into my thigh. A quiet reminder that my leverage wasn't just on paper. Outside, a breeze rustled the leaves along the street, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was reacting to Mallory's disdain or Jasper's passivity. I was moving on my own terms, setting pieces in motion they didn't even realize existed. I glanced once more at the spread of papers, the scanned files glowing on my laptop screen, the faintly smudged signature drying in the dim light. The cicada's drone faded into the background, replaced by a steadier rhythm, the slow, deliberate pulse of a man who had finally decided he'd had enough of being quiet for everyone else's comfort. Tonight wasn't about yelling or confronting. Tonight was about beginning the quiet turn from passive benefactor to something they didn't expect, a man with a plan and the tools to carry it through. By the time the printer cooled and the contract sat crisp and dry on the desk, the anger had been replaced entirely by resolve. My thumb brushed over the raised ridges of the keys once more, and I let out a long, steady breath. The light stayed low, the house stayed silent, but something inside me had shifted, and there was no turning it back. The folding chair beneath me creaked as I shifted my weight, the sound sharp in the otherwise murmuring community hall. Wood-paneled walls rose on either side, their varnished sheen reflecting the faint flicker of overhead fluorescents which buzzed like a tired wasp nest. The faint smell of floor polish hung in the air, mingling with the lingering scent of old paper and coffee from the refreshment table. Early September in Akron had cooled the air outside, but in this room, the temperature carried a stale heaviness like the tension settling between the rows of folding chairs. Across the room, Mallory glanced at me over the rim of her glossy folder, her dark eyes meeting mine for the briefest flicker before sliding away. She was dressed like a woman attending a deposition rather than a community meeting. Sharp blazer, pointed heels, hair pulled taut into a bun, so sleek it shone under the fluorescent buzz. Even from here I could see the faint tension in the set of her jaw, the restless movement of her fingers as they tapped the folder she clutched. Jasper sat beside her, a thin layer of sweat staining the collar of his button-down, his knuckles pale around a manila envelope that sagged in his lap. I adjusted my blazer, feeling the faint weight of the keys in my pocket, a more commanding presence than anything I could say aloud. The brass pressed against the fabric, their notches sharp against my thigh. Every time I shifted slightly, they gave a quiet, authoritative chink, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but enough to remind me why I was here. The HOA representative, a tall woman in a crisp navy skirt suit, cleared her throat at the head of the table. "We're here to address the request for transfer of property title filed by Mrs. Mallory Greaves and Mr. Jasper Greaves," she began, her voice as neutral as the nameplate perched in front of her. "Please state your intentions for the record." Mallory stood smoothly, her folder opening with a snap. "We're seeking full ownership transfer," she said, her voice firm, projecting confidence, though her eyes darted once to Jasper, then quickly back to the room. "This is purely procedural. Lennox has been incredibly generous, but at this point, it's time to simplify the arrangement. We'll take full responsibility for all obligations going forward." She cast a look in my direction, her chin tilted upward just slightly. "We don't want to inconvenience him any further." I let her words hang in the air, absorbing the ripple they sent through the room. A few HOA board members exchanged glances, curious but silent. Silas, seated 2 chairs down from me, leaned back slightly, his expression calm but alert, a small notepad resting open in his lap. Beside him, the property lawyer he'd introduced me to, Mr. Carter, a precise man with horn-rimmed glasses, and a calm demeanor, waited without reaction, his fingers laced neatly on the table. When the HOA rep turned her eyes toward me, I rose. The keys in my pocket shifted their edges, pressing against my palm as I slid a hand into my blazer. "I won't contest their desire to simplify things," I said, my voice steady, quiet enough that the room leaned in instinctively. "But the terms they're proposing are not possible. Not legally." I drew out the original purchase contract, its corners slightly softened with time, but the ink on the signatures still as sharp as the day we'd signed. I laid it on the table gently, the paper making the faintest whisper against the polished surface. Mr. Carter leaned forward, flipping it open to a bookmarked page. "Clause D," I said, my gaze fixed on the HOA rep rather than Mallory, who I could sense stiffening even as I spoke. "No sale reassignment or retitling of the property can occur without my written approval. It's signed by all parties, notarized, and still binding. Any attempt to override it would constitute a breach subject to litigation." The lawyer's finger traced the clause as he nodded once, looking to the HOA rep. "This is valid," Carter said, his tone clinical. "There is no mechanism here for Mrs. and Mr. Greaves to proceed without Mr. Lennox Greaves's consent. Any approval granted by this body without his signature would be legally void." Mallory's mask cracked for the first time. Her grip on her folder tightened, knuckles blanching. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to carry across the table. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let my expression change. "You're right," I said evenly, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the keys. I set them on the table with a calm, deliberate motion, the soft clink echoing just enough in the quiet hall. "It's the beginning." For a long second, nobody moved. The flickering fluorescent light hummed overhead, and I could hear Jasper's shallow breath from across the table. The HOA rep cleared her throat, murmuring something procedural about tabling the motion and review of standing agreements. But the only sound that mattered to me was the quiet chime of the brass keys as they settled on the table's surface, gleaming faintly under the unkind light. Silas leaned toward me as I gathered my papers, his voice pitched low enough for only me to hear. "They didn't see you coming." There was no triumph in his tone, just a quiet affirmation, like a weathered coach acknowledging a well-executed play. I stood sliding the contract back into my folder, leaving the keys resting on the table for one final moment before I picked them up and closed my hand around them. The brass was warm now, the edges no longer just grounding, they felt like proof tangible and undeniable. I didn't bother to look at Mallory or Jasper as I turned and walked out. The squeak of the folding chair as I moved echoed behind me, but I didn't slow my stride. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around me, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. The cicadas' hum was softer here, distant under the drone of traffic from the main road. I slipped the keys back into my pocket, their familiar weight pressing against me with every step. My pace was measured, unhurried. I wasn't walking away from a fight. I was walking away from a performance I no longer needed to attend. My dignity, my control, both reclaimed without a single shout. The doors of the community hall closed softly behind me, muffling the rising voices inside. I didn't glance back. The keys and the contract were with me, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief settle over me, as steady and solid as the metal in my pocket. That night, I sat on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee cupped between both hands. The street was quiet in that particular way. Only early fall can bring no children shrieking, no lawnmowers running, just the faint whisper of wind through trees, shedding the first of their brown-edged leaves. The chalk drawings from earlier still marked the sidewalk across the street, faded. Hopscotch grids, a wobbly sun. The outlines of flowers sketched by hands no bigger than my old work gloves. They would be washed away by the next rain, but for now, they held a sort of fragile permanence in the glow of the porch light. The coffee mug in my hands was cracked, a thin, jagged line running from rim to belly, its fracture bound by a strip of yellow electrical tape I'd wrapped around it months ago. The steam curled lazily upward, disappearing into the chill of the breeze that licked at the corners of the porch. I traced the ridge of the tape with my thumb as I sipped, the faint bitterness of the coffee anchoring me in the present. It felt like I was holding a small metaphor, one I hadn't needed anyone else to spell out. Still cracked, still useful, still mine. The phone buzzed on the little table beside me. Silas's name lit up the screen, the glow catching on the aluminum railing as I picked it up. His voice when I answered was steady as ever, like a rope tossed into rough water. "Town meeting went as expected," he said. Without preamble, his tone not celebratory, but affirming. "They're rattled. But more importantly, you good." I looked out past the driveway to the flag on my mailbox, flapping gently in the breeze, its colors dulled from years in the sun. "Better than I thought I'd be," I said, my voice low but honest. "Feels strange, lighter somehow, empty too, if I'm being truthful." He was quiet for a beat before responding. "Empty can be filled, Len. Listen. Our church is holding an event next week. Elder support. I know public speaking isn't your favorite, but you've got something people could use. You don't need to say yes now, just think about it." We talked a little longer, not about contracts or Mallory or Jasper, but about the things Silas always circled back to, whether old colleagues, the diner's new cook, who didn't know how to fry eggs properly. When we hung up, I sat there with the cracked mug warm in my hands, listening to the wind tugging at the branches and the faint creak of the porch boards beneath my chair. Inside, the house was as silent as ever when I finally stood. The dim light from the kitchen pooled across the hardwood as I rinsed out the mug, careful not to soak the tape that held it together. I set it on the windowsill above the sink, the lamplight catching the sheen of moisture as it dried. Still cracked, still whole. That I realized felt enough for now. At the small desk by the window, I pulled out a notepad and began writing slowly, my pen scratching across the paper in deliberate strokes in honor of my late wife, Ellen. I'd like to make a contribution to the Summit Street Community Center, earmarked for programs supporting older adults and caregivers. The words looked plain on the page, but they felt heavier, sturdier than anything I'd written in years. Before turning in, I found myself pulling down the old photo album from the shelf, the one I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Its spine creaked as I opened it, pages filled with Polaroids and faded 4x6 prints, Ellen in the garden Jasper at a school recital, me in suits from eras past. My thumb lingered on one of Ellen laughing with her hair pulled back, dirt on her hands, a clay pot half planted beside her. I didn't know what the plan was yet, not exactly. But for the first time, it wasn't about salvaging relationships with people who only measured me in dollars. It wasn't about defense or leverage. It was about something new, something that might carry Ellen's name forward in a way that felt right. The porch light flicked once as the wind hit the line, shadows stretching across the porch boards. I closed the album, placed it beside the notepad, and felt a quiet certainty settling into my chest. The breeze outside rustled the trees again, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. I let the smell fill the silence as I switched off the lights, leaving the taped mug glinting softly in the window, catching the last of the porch light before the house fell into stillness. Upstairs, I lay down without the weight of tension pressing on my chest. For once, the quiet didn't feel like isolation. It felt like the start of something entirely my own. The community hall smelled of fresh wood polish and cinnamon cookies, a soft, inviting scent that wrapped itself around the low hum of chatter. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting slanted bands of gold and ruby across the wooden floor. I stood at the modest podium, the weight of a photograph of Ellen in my hand, more grounding than the notes I'd written for myself. She was smiling in the photo dirt on her hands, a half-planted clay pot beside her, captured in a moment that spoke more about who she was than any story I could ever tell. Beside me on the table rested a newly printed certificate of donation, its embossed lettering catching the shifting glow of the stained glass. Next to it sat a small velvet box, soft to the touch, containing the house keys that had once felt like anchors, then weapons, and now finally relics of a chapter I no longer needed to hold on to. The box was shut tight, not to conceal them, but to release them. The hall wasn't large, but every chair was filled. Silas sat in the third row, his posture relaxed, his faint smile betraying the quiet pride he rarely put into words. Around him were neighbors, town members. Faces I mostly knew by sight rather than name. They weren't here for drama or spectacle. They were here because the Summit Street Community Center's elder care wing, the one Ellen had once dreamed of helping, was finally getting the funds to patch its roof and start its caregiver program. I cleared my throat softly, my voice calm but steady, as it carried into the sunlit space. My wife used to say, I began glancing down at the photo. It's better to build something than to buy it. Houses, gardens, memories, they all last longer when you've got a hand in shaping them. I let the words sit for a moment, my fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Ellen wanted to help build this center years ago. Life didn't give her the chance. So today I'd like to make sure her name is here, even if she isn't. I held up the certificate briefly before placing it on the table. This check is for the new elder programs and the repairs you've been putting off. And this, I lifted the velvet box, placing it gently into the hands of the center's director, a woman whose eyes softened as her fingers closed around it. These keys belong to a house I no longer need. I thought I needed it as proof of something, but turns out I didn't. I think they'll do more good here, auctioned, reused, whatever you decide. Ellen always said things should keep moving forward, even when people can't. Applause filled the hall, not loud or raucous, but warm like a ripple of wind through autumn leaves. I stepped away from the podium, carrying nothing now but the photo, and found a seat in the back row. A boy no older than 10 slid into the chair beside me. His hands were sticky with sugar, a half-eaten cookie clutched in one palm. He looked up at me with wide eyes and asked, "Are you the man who helped fix the roof?" I nodded once, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Something like that. He grinned, offering me the other half of his cookie crumbs, scattering onto his lap. I accepted it, the cinnamon and sugar sweet on my tongue, grounding me in a way I didn't expect. When the gathering ended, I stepped out into the crisp, late fall evening, the cold air stinging pleasantly against my cheeks. The sky had begun to dim, the last blush of sunlight retreating behind the rooftops as I made my way down the quiet street. My breath fogged in front of me, a rhythmic cloud, rising and fading with each step. The velvet box was no longer with me. Neither was the weight of those keys. My pockets were empty now, save for the folded photograph of Ellen, which I tucked deeper into my coat as the wind swept across the block. The leaves skittered along the sidewalk like whispered reminders of seasons passing, never pausing. I tilted my head back, looking at the fading light, and let the words escape softly, barely audible even to myself. You were right, Ellen. The view is better when you're not looking back. The breeze caught the words, scattering them into the growing dark. By the time I reached my porch, the first stars were breaking through the navy sky. The house, modest and quiet, greeted me with nothing more than its familiar creak as I opened the door. It didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt like a beginning, the kind Ellen would have approved of, rooted not in bitterness or proving a point, but in the simple, steady act of moving forward. And as the cinnamon sweetness lingered on my tongue, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't counting what I'd lost. I was counting what I could still build. As the last glow of the stained glass light faded, I ran my fingers over the velvet box, now resting empty on my desk. Its lid closed but no longer heavy. Letting go of those keys felt less like losing and more like finally breathing. Life has a way of testing us, and sometimes the ties we fight to keep are the ones holding us back. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone facing loss, betrayal, or a hard goodbye, there's always a way to turn hurt into something that serves more than just yourself. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?